And I was just imagining you, Delia, if you were dropped into that conversation, if you were on the stage as a fourth chair, what would you say in a talk where they're discussing the day after AGI? All right, welcome everybody back to the Humans in the Loop podcast. We are super excited because today we have our first ever guest, Delia McCabe. Delia is incredible. She is a PhD neuroscientist. She is a cognitive resilience specialist. She's an author. She's sought after to be on all different types of media for expertise. She's also fresh off the Cynefin Exploratory that just took place in Vancouver in Canada, my home country. And shameless plug, that same event is going to be happening at Knowledge Summit Dublin, right after Knowledge Summit Dublin on July 1st and 2nd. So I'm sure little odds and sods are going to come out of what Delia experienced and talked about in Vancouver to get you excited about what's coming to Dublin and the content there. But welcome, Delia. We're so happy to have you. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you, Sierra, and thank you, Janine. This is a fascinating subject, so yes, I think we're going to all enjoy it. And obviously, the listeners and viewers will enjoy it too.
Yes, yeah. And like last podcast, what really inspired us to invite you on was we talked about cognitive atrophy. And we more looked at the problem space of it and looking at you as a neuroscientist, how you help organizations improve cognition, optimize cognition. We thought there's probably some solutions or at least next steps that you can offer to help us think through this a bit more. And just as a little bit of recap for the audience, if you didn't catch the last episode, I encourage you to look at it, where we talk about cognitive atrophy in episode 2, this idea that heavy LLM use is maybe making us dumber, reports coming out from MIT to indicate that. So Delia, before we get into all the serious talk, Janine and I, we like to talk about the crack inspired by our Irish friends. So just curious, what is the latest crack in your life? Some good times, fun experiences, things that made you laugh?
I thought about this because when you sent me the pre-questions for the podcast, I thought, which of these am I going to mention? And funnily enough, two of the most recent really fun-filled experiences revolve around sitting at the dining room table with friends in Australia and then with family as well in Australia playing card games. And we ended up laughing so much on the different occasions that we did this, because when you start a new card game, you don't know the rules. And so you keep on making mistakes. And the person that knew the rules was really funny. She said, okay, I'm going to just give you some pointers for the first time we play. And we just laughed so much. It was such a wonderful experience because we saw in action, how the brain grappled in the beginning and then caught on to the game and then eventually could play the game with some knowledge. And when we did it with our children as well, we ended up laughing a lot because it was a game related to medical diagnoses, but really tongue-in-cheek. And our daughter is a doctor. So we ended up laughing so much because she was trying to counter what her knowledge is with these really sham Victorian age medical solutions. And we ended up hysterical again. So those are the experiences that made me think about, this joyful Craig phenomena, because it involved people, it involved learning, it involved, laughing at contradictions, and it just involved friendship. So yeah,
I
those
love
are
that.
mine.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Janine, are you a card player?
I am. I do like it. I do struggle. I was listening there about the rules of the games. I do struggle with rules. I seem to remember them in one sitting, but if I have to do it again, it's like what we were playing there. But like Delia, I had I was thinking about this myself. What was my crack this week? And the world is very technical, as we know, and I do get a bit bogged down by it. But this week, there's been a lot of storms right outside my house. I live on the beach and the weather was atrocious. And I thought, no matter what happens, we're all at the mercy of nature, at Mother Nature. But it worked in my favour this week because I had to walk the dogs in the storm and I came back with the most beautiful beach waves in my hair and the most smoothest skin ever because I'd literally been sandblasted for half an hour with the dogs. And I didn't need any fancy products to get that sort of salt spray look in my face. I mean, I did look like I'd been dragged through a hedge backwards, but it was a very, very refreshing experience. And I did come back to, meetings and work, which was highly technical, and think, yeah, you know what, there's still a lot of, the natural side of the world is still very much in control.
Love that.
I totally love that. It's reminding me, Janine, actually, well, in Ottawa, we've been getting hit with loads of snow. And yesterday I was on a walk with my husband and a car just went whoop into the curb and was just jammed and stuck in the snow. And so you can't just walk by, right? And be like, not my problem. We're like, okay. So we go and we're like, okay, let's help this guy. And it ended up being a crew of like 5 people just digging and digging. And then the girl would try to back up and then she was still stuck. And then we dig. And finally we wedged the car out. And it was this incredible moment of all these strangers who will probably never see each other again. We're like, yes, just like celebrating. And I kid you not, a second car, the exact same thing happened to it just down the street. So with all the people that had helped that car then moved on to help this car. And again, when she was set free, it was like this celebration. And yeah, it was just a beautiful moment of human connection. And, I think this kind of all segues into our conversation today. The podcast is called Humans in the Loop. How do we maintain these connections? Janine, I know you got something to say.
It was just, just thinking 3 ladies coming for a little chat of this sort of, I know what time zone we're in. And, all of these sort of human stories, I don't know if it's because of the way the world is, it seems to amplify the humanness of experiences for me now. Like pulling cars out of snow or ditches or whatever was kind of just a normal thing where, where I live. But now it seems like a very special moment and, things feel very, more human in certain ways. I think because of that contrast with the complex world we're in. So that was my little thought buzz there.
Great.
That's a very good point. I think the contrast is very clear to us because we spend so much time in a virtual environment that when you do have this in-person connection, it feels more special. It just feels like it's an unusual experience, which is really sad for me because they should be part and parcel of who we are and how we live. And especially for the developing brain, it's really, really important because I look at the ages of the people that were involved in the car, the car experience. Young people would be very much more anxious about approaching a person that they'd never met. One of the things that is happening with young people is that they are much more anxious. They've got a lot more social anxiety than we had. We were forced to speak to people at the bus stop or maybe on a train. We didn't have a phone. We just had a book. We had to ask someone a question, how to get to somewhere. We didn't have the GPS. So all of these tiny little moments of opportunity to engage with a stranger, the younger generations don't have that anymore. And that's another aspect to this whole process of, technology taking over. It's taking away all the opportunities for us to learn how to engage with others.
It's a really interesting point. Like, I guess what I'm hearing you say is before it was just kind of taken for granted. You go help your neighbor. And as you say that, Delia, I'm thinking back to the faces of they were young people driving the cars and walking by. And there was this hesitancy of like, I'm going to stare at you, but not actually ask for your help and hope that you get the message.
Perfect example. That hesitancy to approach another human being because we've just become used to doing it online. And so we haven't learned those particular skills because the brain needs to learn those skills when it's busy developing. When it doesn't learn those skills in those specific windows of opportunity or opportunistic windows of development, what happens is it's much harder to learn it later. It's the same as learning a language. When you're young, you learn a language completely and absolutely unself-consciously. You don't have to even focus on learning the language. You just naturally, innately absorb that language, if I can put it that way. The same with social engagement. If that isn't fostered in this time period that the brain wants you to learn how to do that, it's just harder to do it later, just like learning a language. And so because it's harder, you have this level of anxiety related to this. It doesn't feel like an innate natural response to the lived world anymore. And that's where we have this ongoing challenge. And it's a huge challenge because it's affecting how we relate to other people and how they relate to us.
Sierra, this reminds me what Delia's touched on there. When we did the last podcast and we talked about when you're sort of upskilling in the AI, you're de-skilling in something else. And what Delia said there has really hit hard with me, because we were thinking about maybe more the practical skills in the workplace, but this is now playing out in our social culture, or like Delia says, our developing brains. And I never thought about it like that, where there's a moment, like was it the teachable moment, and all of those subtle things that come out of that, getting over the anxiety to go and ask somebody for a direction. That's just a little sort of micro interaction, but what you're learning by going through that is so deep, and we're missing those opportunities. So yeah, that's going to keep me up tonight.
Well, we'll end on a high note because Delia's going to tell us how we can help try and fix this problem.
Yay.
But it's making me. You're getting to one of my questions: is how do we know, what are the signals that this kind of cognitive atrophy is happening, or even this more social atrophy, which I guess is linked to a center of the brain? Like, how do we know if I'm a manager in a workplace? I'm thinking of some of our listeners, a lot of them are knowledge managers, and our knowledge management is predicated on relationships and connection. And so if this skill is receding, how do we know? But not just in our work life, how do we know with our children? I mean, I don't have kids, but I'm surrounded by kids in my life who are growing up with AI in a way that we never did. So yeah, what are the signals?
Good question. One of the first things is that if people can't tolerate being bored. Now, being bored is something that we generally have a negative idea about. But the brain needs us to be bored in terms of just sitting and looking out the window. I have a favorite thing that I love to do is watch the squirrels. I'm a little bit enamored with squirrels. I love their agility. I love their fearlessness. I love how they just jump and trust. So that's one of the things that I do. And I know when I'm doing that, I'm actually allowing my default mode network to step in. And you can think about this as the brain idling. And the brain needs to do this idling because in the process, it's actually accomplishing a whole lot of things while it's doing this idling. So that's the one thing. If people can't tolerate boredom, this is children and this is adults, you know that they are in trouble, because that means that they're used to being stimulated via their devices. And that means they're used to very high levels of dopamine. And if they don't get that dopamine, they go searching for it. And they generally find it in the palm of their hands with their phone. The other thing that happens is that people become less creative, just generally. And you see this at work. They don't have that spark of creativity themselves anymore, or they're losing that capacity because they never allow themselves to be bored and to sit with a challenge for long enough for their memory, where their skills and their knowledge reside, to combine with an idea that has just crossed their path, which will be sitting in their working memory. For that beautiful process of creativity to occur, they're not allowing that to happen because they're just engaged all the time with information. Now, whether that's information via AI/LLM, whether that's just information via their phone, whether it's news, whether it's a dancing cat or bear, or whatever it is, there's no downtime to allow the brain to just work its way through all these things that it's been exposed to bring up this creative idea. One of the questions that I was asked 2 years ago at a conference in Portugal, and it went down like a lead balloon because everyone was still in the hope and hype phase of AI. They said, what do I see the effects of AI as being? And I said, I see us living in a world of homogeneous ideas and products. Creativity arises from individuals' unique experiences interacting with their unique environment, with their unique skills and knowledge, and their unique physiology and neurophysiology, which also interesting comes into this because we are embodied. And nobody liked my response because they didn't yet understand that we don't actually understand creativity in a lot of detail. We don't really understand how that shower moment occurs. We know there are a whole lot of different variables that interact in ways we don't yet fully understand. And we do know 100% for sure that it doesn't work the same way with AI and LLMs. So noticing that people are less creative is another way to say, hold on a second, this is a danger sign. The other thing, of course, is engagement, engagement with other people in teams, making decisions, working on solutions to challenges. That engagement tells you whether that brain is actively looking at these other people and using their information and your information. We call this cognitive distribution. Your brain, you have this brain power distributed among a few different brains. So no one brain has to carry all the load. You're distributing it. Now, if you can't do that really well, it speaks to a lack of the capacity to have that relationship, a lack of capacity to be a little bit unsettled or uncertain and not know something. Also, the lack of a capacity to say, I don't know, what do you think? People don't like to do that generally. It increases our anxiety levels. So those are a few things that you can look at. And then finally, I speak about being embodied a lot. One of the things that you notice when people are not engaged and fully living in their bodies is that they will have tense shoulders, that they will be more hunched over. They will suffer more from headaches. So you'll have people, having more sick days. They will also be speaking about mood challenges. Often they will show their frustration or their anxiety or even their depression in the things that they say or don't say. So those are all just signs that tell you that people are just too immersed in technology, which AI is part of, and they're not engaging fully with their own bodies and with the world around them.
Wow.
That's pretty much blown my mind. Yeah. I'm relating some of what you said there, Delia, to, organizations and knowledge management. So when I think about the average workplace, there isn't time to be bored, to take stock because, there's the emails, there's the meetings, you're constantly on. So how then do you expect people to, have those, like you say, those shower moments, those ideas, those new connections? And then you mentioned about the creativity. I think with the world, the direction that we're going with the world, I think the human creativity is going to be the differentiator in organizations in terms of the success. So if people aren't sort of capable of that level of creativity and the new ideas, it's just going to be, like you say, so homogenous in the way that we think, the way we behave. And then the third point you mentioned about the engagement. So I think when people aren't engaging with each other, then that means we don't have the relationships for sort of knowledge and information to flow. And then, so I'm saying all that, we're under the umbrella of the average organization said, let's have more AI, let's have more LLMs. It's like we're self-sabotaging success. I mean, obviously, this is just my opinion, connecting things on the moment. But I see that playing out in organizations so much.
Janine, very good point. I think, humans have the sense of FOMO, that if you're going to miss out if you don't use AI in some way, shape, or form. But it's only because they don't really value the wonder of human creativity. and where it's brought us thus far. When I work with organizations, I've got a 12-step checklist that I'll walk them through, because what we want to do, firstly, we want to stop people from being or experiencing cognitive overload. And one of the things that leaders do is they inadvertently keep on adding more things to the workflow. And we can talk about this if we still have time. I call it the additive problem. And it's got a cute little story about Lego behind it. But this is one of the things that happens. So leaders, they're fearful of missing out. They add more things. Now they're adding AI. But my 12-point checklist just says to them, okay, this is the first way you are overloading the brains of the people in your organization. This is the second point. This is the third point. And these are all evidence-based strategies that reduce that cognitive overload. So what happens then? Then you allow people to have the space, to have that little moment where they're staring out the window, to have that time where they just catch up with each other. And, I've been thinking about that thing that you said last week. You give them space now because you haven't filled up every single moment of their time at work, believing incorrectly, completely incorrectly, that filling people's time will lead to increased engagement and productivity. That has never been the case. But somehow, because we're living in a world with a tsunami of information, not a lot of knowledge, we have all of this information. We think we've got to get through it. One of the things that we are as humans, we are infovores. And I'm one of those people. I gather information. I've got a folder on my desktop, and I asked everyone at the conference if they have this folder, and I could see, yeah, everyone says, yeah, they've got that folder. You put the things that you think you're going to need and going to look at later, and very seldom do you actually get to them. But it's like a sense of like a security blanket folder that we put the things into, because we're infovores. Now we've got so much information inundating us, and leaders have forgotten that all that information isn't necessarily going to help those people, their team, become more creative and innovative. So that's why I've got my 12-point checklist. I developed it a couple of years ago, and I keep on adding to it because I know that there are always new ways that they're actually undermining the brains that they hired for a reason. Now I can bring in the AI aspect to this and say, well, this is the framework as well that you need to be careful of. So we need to be able to think really carefully. And this speaks directly to what you said when we started, chatting, Sierra. What are the takeaways? One of the main takeaways is just be aware of the fact that there's so much we don't know about the brain. But one thing we do know for sure, that an overloaded brain is not a creative brain. It is not a brain that's going to come up with a wonderful solution and say, wow, let's discuss this. Let's engage around this. An overloaded brain does not do that. And that's one of the reasons. So we basically segueing now into the AI discussion. It's one of the reasons that people are starting to rely on AI now is because they have the sense of cognitive overload, and they're trying to offload it. They're trying to offload this challenge that they have with all this information and not knowing what to do with it by giving it to an LLM and saying, hey, you figure it out.
Yeah, guilty as charged. There's a couple of
Yeah.
times where I've just thought, no, this is having a complete thought storm, and say using Copilot as a bit of a writing partner, and it's literally like just sorting out the stuff and, like you say, reducing that cognitive overload. And I'm wondering, Sierra, whether this is maybe this is a challenge now for knowledge management, or the new role for a knowledge manager is purely to help reduce the cognitive overload or balance or manage. So instead of us focusing on, SharePoint sites and managing information, it's actually how do we help people deal with cognitive overload? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, Janine, that's a fascinating point, because I was thinking back to Janine and I were at a conference in DC, KM World, back in November. And just hearing sort of different phrases out there, KM is the new black in a lot of ways with AI. The dominant narrative that I have heard related to that is around getting your content AI ready. Let's look at, which is super valuable and important. But what I've heard less of is how KM is the new black when it comes not just to getting your content AI ready and in a central place and it's high quality, but it's actually helping with capability building, which I know, Janine, is one of your key focuses, but helping with that creativity that is so important now, especially. And what are the pathways for KMers to do that? And one strategy sounds like, Delia, like you're talking about, is helping to reduce cognitive overload. Is that the starting point?
It has to be the starting point, because now we're going to move into neurophysiology. When the brain has an enormous amount of information to deal with, it has to start prioritizing what is most important. And it battles to do that because there is so much information. So just to step back for a moment, one of the primary goals of the brain is to save neural energy. And it has to do this because there is nowhere in the brain to store energy. We store excess energy on our body. We all know where our body likes to store that energy. You can see it. But there's no place in the brain to store energy. So the brain has to be very, very careful about using neural energy. And so it prioritizes what needs to be addressed and what it thinks can be ignored. Now, the challenge here is that, just to make it really simple, that's one of the reasons we create habits. Because when you've created a habit, you use less neural energy. So the brain loves creating a habit. It loves having a habit, but it doesn't like creating a habit unless it's a bad habit. So that's why people, love chocolate, but they don't love broccoli, because you get a whole lot of dopamine with chocolate, but you don't get any of that with broccoli. So the brain likes to have a habit, but creating a habit takes some neural friction. So now we're back to the neural energy challenge. When the brain is trying to prioritize how it's going to use energy, it primarily will focus on survival, because the brain is the primary survival organ. So if something elicits anxiety, or something makes you concerned about an outcome, then your brain will go, okay, I need to focus on that. That's important. And so it will expend neural energy on that. It will put the other things to the background. But now the more information that you are processing, you're processing it through your prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the greediest part of an already greedy brain. So just to put this into context, 25% plus of the calories that you consume go to fuel your brain. 25%. And the brain is only 2% of the body's body weight. Of that 25%, the prefrontal cortex uses 25%, and it's only 10% of brain volume. And the prefrontal cortex is what makes us capable of being creative, making decisions, thinking about the future, consequences, pattern detection, analysis, deep thought pondering, creativity. It's linked to our personality. It's linked to how we assess a situation and decide, hey, I'm getting involved or I'm not. It is you can think of it as the conductor of the orchestra. And that is the part of the brain that's really battling today, because everything that we encounter, we have to think about, is this part of a pattern? What could it predict? Because this is all related to survival, remember. The more we can have a pattern and predict the pattern, the greater the chances are that we'll be able to avoid a danger and find a mate and food. So now we have this prefrontal cortex. It's completely overloaded and bombarded with information all the time. It works with our working memory to be able to hold 5 or 7 pieces of information at a time, to be able to work through those and say, okay, these are interesting connections. These are ways this fit together that I hadn't thought about before, i.e. creativity, decision-making, challenge solution, so on. But it's continuously being overloaded with more and more and more information. So parts of what's in the working memory fall off. And then we don't have access to that information anymore. So if you've got 50 tabs open, every time you look at a tab, it's using a little bit of neural energy. And if your brain says, hold on a second, I can't look at any tabs now, that uses neural energy, because your prefrontal cortex is also the major part of your brain, which is the inhibitory. It has an inhibitory function. So when you're working at your desk and you say, I really, really want to check my phone, but I'm not going to check my phone, what's happening is that your prefrontal cortex is using energy to inhibit that behavior. So we've got all of this going on under the covers. And so people go, okay, I'm just going to throw this at an LLM and it's going to come up with a solution, because I've got too much going on in my brain now. But now we have some other challenges. And so I made notes of 3 of them, because I discussed quite a few of them in Vancouver. But the first one is, we have something called the anchor effect, or an anchor bias. The first piece of information that we are exposed to about something has an inordinate weight on how we perceive that specific topic or that information. Even if we are exposed to other pieces of information later, that first piece of information holds the most neural weight, if you want to think about it that way. That's why it's called the anchor effect. So now you feed something into the LLM and it comes back with something and you hadn't thought about that yet. And now that takes up more mental space than anything that follows from that. Okay. And it does that. Why? Because it saves neural energy. You don't have to think about alternatives. You've got that one thing that you can hanker down on. The second effect that we have is we have a fluency bias. Now, the fluency bias is really a scary one because the faster it is for us to grasp and understand a piece of information, the more likely we'll believe that information and trust that information. So, simplicity equals belief, if we can phrase it that way. So now you put information into the LLM, it comes back with a really simple solution, and you're much more prone to believe that than to believe something that is a little bit more complex. Now, LLMs are designed to be as simple as possible so that most people grasp what they're saying. That means that it's easier to fool you into believing that this is the truth and that you should believe it because your brain is going, oh, I save neural energy, when I just look at something and believe that it's true and trust it because it's simple to understand. So that's the second bias, which is worth knowing and understanding. The third one is called the illusory truth bias or effect. This is an interesting one as well because it also works because of this brain's desire to save neural energy. So the illusory truth effect is quite sobering because what it basically says is that the more times that you are exposed to information, the greater the chances are that you're going to believe it, even if in the beginning you knew it wasn't true. So these three biases and effects all play off or underpinned by the brain's desire to save neural energy. So when people are engaging with LLMs and AI, those are just three of many neural effects that occur. We've got the Google effect, we've got the Fora effect, we've got the feeling of knowing effect, all the other effects that are part of the framework that I use when I help teams figure out when and how they should use AI. They all influence how we interact with this new form of information. And it's hard to negotiate with them because they are underpinned by a natural neurophysiological drive that we have as a species. And then I'll throw one more piece of information in here, and then I'll be quiet and you can tell me what you think. When this happens in the developing brain, we have another challenge because that developing brain isn't developing a cognitive reserve that is required to keep the brain healthy across a lifetime. We call this the cognitive behavioral brain reserve. That's a technical term for this. So when developing brains are exposed to information very quickly, they don't have to learn to understand that information. They don't have to consolidate that information in memory. They don't have to recall that information, which is why the MIT study with Natalia Kosmena was so interesting, and we can come back to that later. When the brain isn't doing all of those things while it's developing, and it's supposed to be developing very robust neural pathways, it will always default to those neural pathways that it is developing, which are short, they're not deeply connected to other neurons. You know, each neuron can have up to 15,000 different connections with other neurons. That's one of the things that helps our cognitive reserve. If the brain isn't developing, taking all of that into account, then it will just default to always use the easiest, less neural energy requiring whatever that is, whether it's an AI LLM, whether it's a social media platform, whether it's ed tech with great promises, but mostly mythical. There we go.
Yeah, I think you've just summarised there everything that I was concerned about with social media. I think the influence of social media, even just with those 3 biases that you mentioned, I mean, that's enough biases to cause a problem, isn't it? We don't even need any more than those 3. And then, like you say, there's even more involved. And I did read about the, the sort of stopping developing brains having access to social media until a certain age. And everything that you said there scientifically backs that up, why we shouldn't. We're creating a different kind of human now, aren't we, with these shorter connections. I don't know if those shorter connections or the brains that we're training up is going to be an advantage or disadvantage for the future longer term. I'm guessing a bit of a disadvantage, who knows? But it's really scary, Delia. It's scary that, and we're making this happen. It's almost like we're creating, humans are creating this problem and then finding these poor solutions to try and fix it. Yeah, that's really blown my mind.
Yeah, I'm just, absorbing all of what you're saying. And actually, I was recently just watching a talk with Davos just recently happening. And there was a talk called The Day After AGI, this future that, reading an essay posted by Sam Altman. We are a super intelligence firm. There's this desire and drive to scale machine intelligence to the point of exceeding human capability, where from an intelligence standpoint. And I was just imagining you, Delia, if you were dropped into that conversation, if you were on the stage as a 4th chair, what would you say in a talk where they're discussing the day after AGI, where there are tech experts, one from Anthropic, I think, just talking about predicting by 2027, we're going to be there, or by the 2030s. And Sam Altman, not in this talk, but this essay declaring, like, we are a super intelligence firm. I'm just curious, like, what perspective you offer back with everything that you've just shared about the cautions and the dangers to our brain.
The first thing that I have to just mention, and I'll have to mention that on that stage as well, is that there's a very specific psychographic that has designed these AI LLMs. These are people who do not necessarily value the same things that the majority of humankind value. These are people that value intellect above everything. They value growth without looking at whether growth is actually progress. They value their own intellect and harnessing other people to follow their mission, regardless of where that mission will lead. They don't actually think the same way the majority of us think. I believe that they also have some other challenges, which I won't address on this podcast, very contentious issues about morality and integrity. So those are the things that's the first thing that I would suggest. I would suggest that them as a specific psychographic is speaking for everybody, and not everybody in the world thinks like they think. That's the first thing. The second thing I would remind them is that they do not know how the human brain functions, and they do not know, there is no planet B to see whether this turns out better or that turns out better. But one thing we all know for sure, and the evidence is 100% clear on this, is that none of these platforms, none of these ways of virtually engaging with other human beings has made the younger generations happier. It's done exactly the opposite. So that is a very fine sign to tell us that there's something about what they are creating that is making people miserable. And the third thing that I will mention is that there is something called digital dementia. It is a term that is a real term. It is not a made-up term. This is not my opinion. I didn't suck this out of my thumb. I didn't gather it from the ether. It is a term that explains that when you do not build up that deep cognitive reserve via deep and robust neuronal connections in your childhood and your middle years, you have a significantly greater chance of getting Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. That is the term, Alzheimer's disease or related dementias. I have a graph, and I showed this graph to the participants in Vancouver. I also showed them the graph of the developing brain and how the developing brain needs these particular inputs at particular stages. And one of the people at the end of the presentation, when they had to get together to discuss their thoughts, he had one phrase, and his phrase was, "We're cooked." So, Sierra, in answer to your question, that is what I would say if I was on that stage. I would say we are not protecting the most sophisticated and sensitive tissue that we have ever encountered on this planet, which is what sits between our ears. The people that have developed these systems and these programs and these platforms do not understand neural connectivity. They don't understand the prefrontal cortex. They don't understand what is also termed spike-timed potential plasticity, which is the timing of a neuronal electrochemical signal. The timing influences whether that information will be consolidated in memory or not. They haven't considered any of those things. They have no knowledge in that. They have no interest in knowing about that. They do not care about the future of our species. This is a species-altering effect. And anyone that wants to argue against that doesn't understand anything about the brain and the body.
When Sierra, you mentioned about you mentioned about like the most intelligent machines and all that, everything that Delia has just spoken about in this short time confirms to me that there's so much potential in the human brain that we haven't even discovered. Why are people saying that these machines and these technologies are the super intelligent? Surely that's still us, especially because we haven't even explored it. And like you say, there's sensitive tissue that can do these amazing things. And we're damaging it. I liked what you said, Delia, that it's a species altering. I think we shouldn't shy away from that. I think the facts are very clear. Just this, I know that you've got so many more facts to say about this, Delia, and even the ones that you've shared in this short time confirmed to me that, this is a real societal issue that we're bringing upon ourselves. And I was really interested when you said about the psychographic of these people who are producing this. I feel like I'm being made to operate in a way that's very, it gives me friction. I don't want to move at this fast pace. I don't want to have to consume all this information. I want to be creative. But it's like being on a treadmill of keeping up with somebody else's tune. And now that I think about it, it feels anyway that the majority of people don't want to be in that situation, but we're being forced there for some sort of alternative agenda. It just, this conversation really expresses to me a lot more about how dangerous it is, not just for our brains, but the implication of that, how we make decisions, how we make choices. We form our societies and our world, and if we're making dodgy decisions because we're basing it off information that we've just heard, we haven't understood correctly, or according to those biases that you said before, Delia, then that's influencing every decision. It's influencing actions in our life. It's influencing our world, how we behave. This sort of ripple out.
Just, Sierra, I'm sure that you want to say something, but I just want to point out something important, Janine. I think a lot of people, we sense some kind of a conspiracy, but there is not actually a conspiracy. Our brains have actually conspired to enable these particular people to use our natural drives against us. So the brain's desire to save energy, the brain's desire for lots of dopamine, the brain's desire for novelty. All of those things they've used, not initially understanding necessarily what was going to happen, but it has happened and it's unfolded as it has. The brain does not care what you expose it to. It simply changes in response to. And so what they have done, they've just made it very easy for a overloaded brain in a very complex world. This particular setting that we now find ourselves in, we're particularly vulnerable to this. And the second point that I just want to mention, which I think is important, is that you only protect something if you value it. They don't understand enough about the brain to value it. They don't care about protecting it. So we shouldn't be surprised that they've come up with these ways to hijack our brain's natural tendencies.
Yeah. I wonder if we could sort of start a quiet rebellion. I was just thinking about when you mentioned about the related dementias, when people talk about language learning and how that can counteract reduce dementias, if we use LLMs and AI for that stuff, that just kind of saves us time or helps us deal with the mass things. But say we learn a language by connecting with somebody and, discussing and learning it. I think the word that stood out, what you mentioned there, is the vulnerability. I think actually that's what I'm feeling in this world today. Vulnerable and exposed, that anybody can kind of hijack my brain. But I'm pleased you pointed that out, that I do like the good conspiracy theory now and again, but I think you're right, this isn't quite a conspiracy theory, it's just turned out that way. Sierra, over to you.
No, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I think I want to leave our listeners with a sense of hope as we go down these, scary pathways. One thing that has given me hope is how, actually, I'm going to talk about Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. That book has managed to mobilize, I think it's an excellent example of knowledge management on what social media is doing to our youth. You hear it cited on several podcasts. So borrowing from that, I'm wondering, how do we mobilize a message that is compelling enough to people to pause before they engage with, I'm looking at it right now, that pretty little ribbon of Copilot or the magical unicorn star thing that's just gonna make this happen in 2 seconds. How do you mobilize your message, Delia? And what can we learn from Jonathan Haidt's book that I think is making a difference in a positive way?
I love this question because we do need to leave with hope and something that we can action. I think anybody listening to this, watching this, will already have been open to asking questions. And that's the first important step. Let's understand a little bit more about how the brain functions before we, do all this cognitive offloading. So I think an awareness of the sensitivity and the sophistication of the brain is really important. We need to value it. We need to protect it. We need to consider how it's functioning in this world. The second thing is, of course, just think about how you're using these tools. Don't have a knee-jerk reaction to go to that tool first. Sit down yourself, grapple with an idea. Send somebody a text, give somebody a call, jump on a Zoom, say, what do you think about this? All of that produces neural friction. The brain needs neural friction to be able to learn. The brain needs other brains to be able to flesh out an idea. Think about the problems related to this particular challenge. If we do this, that can happen. In complex situations, you need more brains involved. So first do that. Make that your default choice, not jumping to one of these tools initially. And then be aware of those 3 biases. They are very important. They're not the only ones, but they're 3 of the most important ones. So have a look at that and think about, was that the first thing that I saw in relation to that information? Was that really easy to understand? It was too easy to understand. How many times have I seen that piece of information, even though I was a suspect in the beginning? So we can ask ourselves those questions, and that's part of what my framework involves. The other thing I think that we need to do, we need to step back from the world more regularly. I speak to people who tell me that they go for a walk and listen to a podcast. They're trying to multitask because of this fear of missing out and the tsunami of information. Go for a walk and leave your device at home. Go and look at nature. There's something that the brain loves in nature called soft fascination. Shapes are changing. Colors are changing. Light is changing. There's something in the natural world that the brain calms down when it observes. It switches on our parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest nervous system. And it switches off the sympathetic nervous system, which is your stress nervous system. We need much more of PNS activation. Just as a very small example, every single time you open an email, you hold your breath a little, which stimulates the stress response. We call this email apnea. The more emails you've got, the greater the chances are you're going to be in a state of mild distress most of the time. So we need to involve ourselves and engage ourselves much more in nature. You can see what my background is. Trees. Once we do that, we separate ourselves from this artificial world of so-called brilliance and intelligence, which it isn't, in all honesty. And we find ourselves again. We start to trust ourselves again, trust our own innate knowledge, wisdom, experience, our own memories. And then we connect to other people who do the same. And slowly we'll hold on to this part of us that keeps us fully human and allows us to solve the huge challenges we've got, like dealing with this challenge.
Yeah.
I don't feel so bad now about going on the dunes and being sandblasted by the storm now. That certainly activated my nervous system.
Really go out and look for some more cars to push out of the snow. I think what you're getting at there of getting out in nature, even as we were talking before this podcast, where my name comes from, my parents sitting around campfires in Rocky Mountains, looking at mountains. And there's this element of transcendence. No human can create that mountain or that tree. And there's this reminder, I think, in that, that humans they're creating all these machines that are putting this premium on intelligence as the main factor that defines who we are as humans. But there's so much more to us than just intelligence. So I really appreciate everything you brought, Delia. What you have to say is so important. And I hope, as good knowledge managers that we try to be, that we can help spread this through our own channel. And just a big thank you, Delia. Thank you, Janine. I don't know, any final words before we sign off?
People have told me that this is a really negative message. And, it's filled with doom and horror. And I counter that and I say, human beings have survived through terrible, terrible disasters before. There's something about the human spirit that is amazing. And there's something about it that we need to be awestruck about. So I would much rather people have this information, because this information is knowledge. It gives us power. We can counter what we keep on feeling we've been, shoved to do. We can counter it with our own decision making, our own choices. So I just want everybody to know that knowledge is power, even if the information is unsettling. Would you rather not know this, or would you rather say, I'm standing firm, I'm going to help my family, I'm going to help my children, like Jonathan Haidt did with his excellent book. He marshaled a group of people who said, no, we're putting our children first. And those decisions are very, very long-reaching. So knowledge is power.
Well said, Delia. Well said.
I don't think we need to add any more.
No.
Well, thank you, Delia. Thank you, Janine. It's been great chatting with you.